and Amy. So, boy, we've got the deaths of both Chuck Berry and Chuck Barris, not to be confused in the same week.
What do you, Chuck? Oh, that's right.
Chuck Barris, Chuck Berry.
Berry, right.
Don't confuse the two. One thought he was a CIA assassin. The other is the godfather of rock and roll. So you can keep the two apart.
Yes.
And also we have to mention Jerry Krause.
Jerry Krause, otherwise known as Crumbs. That's what people in the media would call him, because every time they'd go to interview him, he'd always have some crumbs on his tie or on his shirt. But he was a working class guy from the northwest side of Chicago.
Scouting talent gets a guy hungry.
Yeah, and he played baseball at Taft High School, and he always knew that he wanted to be in sports, but he couldn't play the game, so he wanted to be part of the game.
And obviously you had everybody from Michael Jordan to Jerry Reinsdorf weigh in on Krause's
John Paxson,
Paxson Krause's responsibility, his role in the Bulls dynasty. Jordan giving him credit for the dynasty, for being one of the architects of the dynasty,
and
Jerry Reinsdorf saying that he wouldn't be in the Hall of Fame without Jerry Krause.
And he and Jordan weren't particularly good friends, but Jordan respected him and his work ethic, and said the way he was raised is the man that he became as a businessman.
Yeah, he just didn't want to have
genius.
Just didn't want to have a meal with him because it was so messy. It's like a one-man food fight. I'm not being asked to do Jerry Krause's eulogy.
Okay.
So here's the thing yesterday about the Comey hearing before the House Intelligence Committee. One clip that we didn't catch during the show yesterday that is worth playing for you all is an exchange between a young congresswoman from upstate New York, Elise Stefanik, and Jim Comey. Listen to this exchange about, okay, so the investigation began in July. What's the protocol to brief the relevant parties about the nature, scope, progress on the investigation in terms of the timing? And was that timing abided in this case? Listen to this.
There is a practice of a quarterly briefing on sensitive cases to the chair and ranking of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And the reason I hesitate is, thanks to feedback we've gotten, we're trying to make it better. And that involves a briefing of the Department of Justice, I believe the DNI, and some portion of the National Security Council at the White House.
So if that's quarterly...
To brief them before Congress is briefed.
So it's quarterly for all three, then senior congressional leadership, the White House, and the DNI?
I think that's right. Now, that's by practice, not by rule or by written policy, which is why, thanks to the chair and ranking giving us feedback, we're trying to tweak it in certain ways.
So since in your opening statement you confirmed that there is a counterintelligence investigation currently open, and you also referenced that it started in July, when did you notify the DNI, the White House, or senior congressional leadership?
It's a good question. Congressional leadership, sometime recently, they were briefed on the nature of the investigation in some detail, as I said. Obviously, the Department of Justice has been aware of it all along. The DNI, I don't know what the DNI's knowledge of it was, because we didn't have a DNI until Mr. Coates took office, and I briefed him his first morning in office.
So just to drill down on this, if the open investigation began in July and the briefing of congressional leadership only occurred recently, why was there no notification prior to the past month?
I think our decision was it was a matter of such sensitivity that we wouldn't include it in the quarterly briefings.
Yeah, that's curious. That whole thing is curious. First of all, that's not true that there was no DNI. James Clapper was the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. Number two, you said at the outset we do these quarterly briefings on sensitive matters, and now you're saying that you didn't follow the practice in this case because of the sensitivity of the matter. So what's the kind of the DEFCON levels of sensitivity such that you decide to dispense with your practice, your customary practice of those quarterly briefings on matters such as this? Very interesting exchange that I think needs to be plumbed more deeply, but perhaps I'm just tilting at windmills. For an expert opinion on this, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Colonel Cedric Leighton, who is military intelligence expert and security consultant and has served on both the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. Good morning to you and Amy.
So, did you heard that exchange between the congresswoman, and Jim Comey? What about that? Does that raise any flags for you?
Well, it does actually, and you make a very interesting and valid point. I think if you have a forum or a mechanism to brief congressional leaders and obviously members of the executive branch on a quarterly basis on extremely sensitive investigations, what do you do when the investigation becomes super extremely sensitive, which apparently this one is? Clearly there's some confusion there, and the way the FBI director was responding, they are in the process of revamping how they do this. The problem that you run into is, there is a mechanism in place, and if you don't follow that mechanism, because things are even more sensitive than you originally envisioned, then you really don't have a set rule, a set series of procedures. Are there other things that work? Is there some type of cover-up or some type of, FBI situation that, we don't know about? That's really hard to say from this. You want to be very careful, obviously with things like that. But, it does seem to me that there should be a much more stringent review process, and there should also be a way in which you go beyond quarterly briefings. If something like this is happening and you're ready to talk to, or you need to talk to the top leadership, then you need to find a way to do that almost immediately, I think.
Do you think during James Comey's testimony that he was being political at all?
Well, that's, I think anything in Washington is by almost definition political. However, he's trying to, in essence, toe a line. He obviously got into trouble for, things related to the campaign, when it came to Hillary Clinton's issues with her server and the investigations pursuant to that. First it was on, then it was off, then it was on, then it was on again. I think he was trying very hard not to be political, but it struck me that the types of things that he was discussing when it came to Trump and President Trump and the potential ties to Russia were of such a sensitive nature that he was trying to just say, okay, these are the facts, this is what's going on here, but there's obviously politics involved in anything you do.
Yeah, but when he talks about how Putin hates Hillary Clinton, and this is the impetus for him to investigate, this is the impetus for Putin to try and subvert the 2016 election, that's a political statement. And by the way, it's a political statement that a lot of people who have just as much, if not more, geopolitical knowledge than James Comey disagree with in terms of Putin. And James Comey also disagrees with James Comey that it's about Hillary Clinton, because he said the Russians are going to do it again prospectively in terms of trying to hack our elections, trying to disrupt our elections, because the real play is to, undermine the representative republic that we enjoy.
Right, and this is, the idea of the, potential visceral hatred or supposed visceral hatred that Putin has for Hillary Clinton may be true, but Putin himself said something very interesting, sort of related to this. He basically said that all statesmen have the interests of their country at heart. They don't play with emotion. They don't use emotion to force their hand in anything or to direct what they do. So Putin gave us a clue that I think FBI Director Comey is incorrect in that particular aspect, because it is not emotion that rules Putin's things that he does, but what is happening here is he is actually protecting his state's interest in his point of view, and he is doing what he needs to do to subvert the republic, to do the types of things that he can in order to, in essence, get the biggest prize. And that's what the United States is for him. We are the big prize.
Do you think that this show that we saw yesterday and the competing conspiracy theories that are founded on no demonstrable evidence, at least none that's been presented to this point, is exactly what Putin wants? That this is working out better than he could have imagined?
it's certainly working out better than he could have imagined. I think the part of the FBI director's testimony that was pretty much on the mark was that they got into this and they thought, well, let's see what we can do. The Russians, that is, let's see how far we can go with this hack of the DNC. Let's see what kind of things we can get into. And then once they were able to get into the DNC's network with their hacking, then they realized that what they could do is exercise a whole bunch of influence operations, and that, in essence, is what the Russians are doing. They're doing that to this day. They are making very sure that they are the thing that we talk about, the country that we talk about, and that gives them an outsized amount of power, much more than their military could give them, much more than anything else could give them.
Now, during the House Intel hearing, we learned that the FBI started an inquiry into Trump's aides and their links to the Kremlin last July. Are we talking about Paul Manafort, Carter Page, Roger Stone? Do you have any information?
Well, yes, we are talking probably about all of them. Certainly Paul Manafort is, at the top of the list of people being investigated. And, one of the big things about that is Mr. Manafort had a lot of relationships with the Ukrainian government of former President Yanukovych. And Yanukovych was a person that was working at the behest of the Kremlin. So there were connections with Manafort and Yanukovych. Yanukovych has connections to the Kremlin, and that was obviously an arrangement, so far, from what we know so far, that involved a payment, a series of payments, potentially as, in the $12.7 million range. So those payments were for services, consulting services. Those can be typical arrangements that a lot of lobbying firms do with foreign governments, foreign political parties, foreign leaders. But the way in which the payments are being described, there's a Ukrainian legislator that is saying that these payments, are definitely tied to Manafort. That still remains to be seen based on real investigations.
I mean,
but that's the key.
That Ukrainian legislator suggesting that Manafort laundered money for Yanukovych, and wherever it goes, it goes. I have no kind of fealty to Paul Manafort. But even if all of that is true, and I know that the cloud is what the left is trying to keep over this administration, particularly on this matter of Russia. Even if all that's true about Manafort, what does that have to do with making the connection to Russia, Russian collusion with respect to the 2016 election? Those are still two separate matters until you make a direct link.
That's true. And so when an investigation of this type happens, what you're dealing with is there are accusations, there's a supposition, there's a theory, then investigators then develop a theory, and in this case, the theory might be that Manafort's links to the Ukrainian government of the time and to Russia were also then links to that potentially the Trump campaign had to Russia. Now,
right.
That would be a leap. That would be something that would have to be based on actual evidence of ties. Things that they are looking at are, why are certain statements being made by the Trump administration that seem to favor President Putin of Russia and the Russian government and things like that. So that becomes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is anything nefarious going on, and that's where an investigation would have to uncover what are the exact relationships and how much is actually being done because somebody got paid in Ukraine for doing certain political consultant work and other influence type work in that particular environment. So Manafort's connection to the government of Ukraine at that time, is certainly going to be the top subject of investigation. Carter Page, is somebody else that you mentioned. He is under a lot of suspicion because of his very pro-Russia stance in many issues, and that then also leads one to his business dealings. And a lot of that still remains to be uncovered. And of course, people are going to try to, if there is something, they're going to try to keep it under wraps. And that's where investigators are going to have, quite a challenge.
Before we let you go, I'm no North Korean policy expert like a Dennis Rodman or a James Franco or a Seth Rogen. So I need some help here. Richard Haas, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, had an op-ed this week that we're out of time in North Korea, that this may be the first genuine crisis of Trump's presidency in the international arena, that you've heard Rexon, as I've termed him, Rex Tillerson, talking about the prospect of a change in U.S. policy towards North Korea, a more aggressive posture towards North Korea, not just jawboning that little dictator over there, Kim Jong-un. And I can't figure out, you've got North Korea putting out propaganda films, probably inspired by Snoop Dogg this week. You've got North Korea saying they don't fear sanctions. They're close to first strike capability. And then yesterday they do a missile test that explodes within seconds of launch, and they look like, this inept backward nation that they otherwise are. So give us a threat assessment on North Korea.
So a lot of people are in the business, Dan, of making the threat be 10 foot tall when it's really 5 feet tall. And the way in which North Korea operates is through a lot of bluster, through a lot of propaganda. They have made some significant developments in their missile technology. However, then they tested that rocket engine, on Sunday that has gotten a lot of attention. But they always are very quick to make sure that they do things in a very forward way when it comes to their propaganda. So their propaganda will give them more capabilities than they actually have, but they are still a dangerous threat. And that is the challenge that somebody like Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, is going to have, because he definitely wants to do something that changes the equation on the Korean Peninsula, but that equation has really been based on China not leveraging North Korea the way it should, and also South Korea and the United States insisting that they actually not, get into a situation where they give North Korea more credit than it is due.
He is Lieutenant Colonel Cedric Leighton, military intelligence expert, security consultant now. He's served previously on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks so much for joining us as always. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. Absolutely.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.